Evening, everybody. The hearing session is now open. It forms part of the examination of the South London Waste Plan. I'm GJ Fort. I'm one of the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination alongside my colleague, Inspector Stephen Normington, and we will report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearing is a structured and focused discussion that we shall lead. So before we continue any further, could I invite the representatives of the boroughs to introduce themselves, please?
Sir, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dean James. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at the London Borough of Sutton.
My name's Patrick Witter, Senior Planner at Sutton Council.
Julia Dorr, London Borough of Croydon, Plan lead.
Tara Butler, London Borough of Merton.
Eben van der Westhuizen, London Borough of Merton, Planning Policy Officer.
Davide Pascarella, Merton Council, Air Quality Officer.
Tom Wright, Principal Planning Policy Officer at the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames.
Thomas Sild, Senior Planning Policy Officer, Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames.
Thank you. And could I invite other participants who are in the room to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Peter West. I'm talking on behalf of the Wimbledon Park Resident Association.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian Simpson. I'm chairman of the Wimbledon Park Residents Association.
Hi, Chris Furness from Suez Recycling and Recovery UK.
And could I invite those joining us on Zoom to introduce themselves, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Maya Crutchley. I'm from the London Borough of Merton, Air Quality.
Good afternoon, David Payne, BPP Consulting, representing 777.
Good afternoon, Alan Potter from BPP Consulting, representing 777.
Thank you. So also joining us is Carmel Edwards, who's the Programme Officer for the examination. She's responsible for organising hearing sessions and the publication of documentation, and should be your first point of contact for any assistance required. Outside of the hearing sessions, Inspector Normington and I will only communicate with the boroughs and other parties via Miss Edwards. And once again, Mr. van der Westhuizen, could I ask you to make your housekeeping announcements?
Can I remind you to please switch your mobile phones off now or put it on silent mode. The toilets are at ground level at the main entrance to the Civic Centre, just to the left of the stairs leading up to the council chamber. There's a drinking water dispenser near the entrance to the toilets. Please use the alcohol wipes and hand gel that is available on the table at the entrance to the chamber. There are no fire drills scheduled during the hearing hours today. If the fire alarm sounds, either intermittently or continuously, please leave the building immediately by the nearest available fire exit without stopping to collect belongings. Staff will direct you to the exits and fire assembly point. If you are unable to use the stairs, a member of staff will assist you. The hearing will reconvene if it's safe to do so, otherwise it will stand adjourned. Please ensure that you've signed the attendance sheet on the table at the entrance to the chamber. Please note that this meeting is being filmed for publication on the Council's YouTube channel. Therefore, if you're participating in this meeting, you are consenting to being recorded and to the use of this recording for broadcasting. When the inspectors invite participants to speak, they need to press the little silver button with an icon of a head at the base of the microphone in front of them. A red light will shine on the microphone, indicating that the microphone is on, and the camera will focus on the speaker. When the participant has finished speaking, they must press the same button again to switch the microphone off, which will switch the red light off and the camera focus will draw back. Zoom participants should remain muted until the inspector invites them to speak, and they should use the raised hand tool to indicate to inspectors when they would like an opportunity to speak. There's an induction loop system in the council for people with hearing difficulties.
Thank you. So just before we progress further, just a reminder of Inspector Norrington and my roles in this. We're tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist us in that regard. In submitting the plan, the boroughs consider that it is sound, and this is the starting point for the examination. So if you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you will need to explain why and what changes might be necessary to make it sound. We have read and will take into account all the hearing statements that have been prepared and also the original representations that were made. So there is no need for these to be substantially repeated. Instead, our aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with questions that we have or areas where further clarification or explanation might be required. At times, we may ask for a more general contribution or a summary of your position. If you wish to comment, then please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side. And we may also invite contributions from you on specific points where we think this may assist the examination. If you wish to highlight certain parts of your statement or other documents that form part of the examination, then it will be helpful to me if you can provide the reference. Okay, are there any questions at this stage about the procedural matters related to the hearing? Okay, then if we could progress with discussions now. It's out of order of the timetable we'd sent round previously, but I gather in this morning's session, Mr. Payne had some difficulty of interacting with the Zoom function, and he had a couple of points that he wanted to make on the potential modifications that we discussed as part of matter 3. So Inspector Norrington and I thought it would be appropriate to cover those before we start to discuss matter 4. So if I could ask Mr. Payne to come in if he can on Zoom and just make those points, please.
Thank you, sir. The first one, I think, was relating to the summing up by the boroughs just before lunch, where reference was made to the consensus that the throughput at site S1, the 777 site, was falling, but I didn't pick up any summing up which referred to the boroughs making a modification, proposing a modification to remove reference to S1 from the plan. So from page 80 and from appendix 2, page 100. So it was just confirmation that that was proposed by the boroughs. That's the first question.
Okay, Mr. James, have you got a response to that?
Certainly. So the borough's position is we would be willing to put forward a modification to delete site S1 so that it would no longer be a safeguarded waste site. And we acknowledge that alongside that proposed modification, we would have to provide evidence as to why that was justified, which we will do. But to confirm that we would be putting forward a modification to delete the 777 site.
Thank you. And your other point, Mr. Payne.
you very much. Thank you to Mr. James for confirming that. The other one was really around the role of the GLA from here on in and the mayor. I understand, obviously, that it's the inspector's role to test the soundness on behalf of the Secretary of State. And I think the discussions yesterday and today achieved consensus that general conformity would be achieved through demonstration that there is sufficient capacity and in fact a surplus of capacity for waste management to deliver the London Plan apportionments and net self-sufficiency. So conformity, general conformity with the plan in that regard. And also around paragraph 9.9.2 about the plan-led process, releasing sites from safeguarding. But I think it goes back to the point which you asked me first thing yesterday around clause A in policy SI 9, which just states existing waste sites should be safeguarded. Obviously, if the modification removes S1 from safeguarding, then that clause doesn't apply. So my question is really around from here on in, once modifications are made and then consulted on, the GLA presumably will be a consultee, but only a consultee. And they don't have any, as far as I know, any power of veto, if you like, over whether a plan is adopted if they still object to site S1 being removed from safeguarding, if they deem that to not be in conformity with the London Plan. So I know it's a bit circular. It was just trying to get a bit of clarity about any potential hiccups involving the GLA from here on. Thanks. Thank you.
Have you got any views on that point in terms of the GLA, Mr. James? I mean, certainly Inspector Normanton and I discussed this, and our initial view was it would be useful to have the GLA involved at an early stage on any modifications that come forward, particularly in, you know, because we might alter the plan one way and it might put it out of whack in terms of general conformity, or at least the mayor's view in terms of that. So our view was that should be prior to consulting on the main mods, but I wonder whether you have a view on that, Mr. James.
Yeah, so just to reiterate my first point, we understand that we're obviously going to have to put forward evidence to justify the removal of that site. I think we're confident that there is reasonable justification for that. I think that the GLA will understand the logic of that argument, notwithstanding that policy SI 9 Part A, but it does say, as we discussed yesterday in the amplification, that waste sites should be, if they are going to be released, it should be, you know, through the plan-led process. So I don't anticipate them having any issue with them. I think there's a good case there. But we're very happy to talk to the GLA prior to that main mods consultation. We can have a meeting with them, duty to cooperate meeting, to discuss what we're proposing and get their views. But I would be confident that they would be comfortable with that position. Obviously not wishing to speak for them, but that would be my view.
Thank you, Mr. James. Mr. Potter, you have your hand up.
So thank you. Yeah, just really emphasising the point around the desire for a degree of certainty, but also I guess it's around this term general conformity with the London Plan, and if the South London Waste Plan is providing sufficient capacity to meet the London Plan apportionments for the boroughs and net self-sufficiency, to what level of detail or ought the GLA to look at from the point of view to satisfy itself that general conformity is being met. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Payne, did you have anything further on this point?
No, thanks. That's very helpful clarification from Mr. James. Thanks for the opportunity to come in.
Thank you. So any final points on this, Mr. James, before we move on?
No, I've got nothing further to add.
Thank you. So if we can now move on to our discussion of matter 4. So as usual, I'll start out with a general question to the boroughs in terms of the matter as a whole. So does the plan set out an effective suite of policies for the management of waste in the area, and are they justified and consistent with national policy?
Thank you, sir. Our position is that the plan does do that. We do believe that there is an effective suite of policies that are justified and consistent with the national policy, alongside the modifications that we proposed to the plan, and collectively we're of the view that we achieve that. I don't think I will add any more. It's quite a wide-ranging matter, this one, with some quite detailed points. So I think I'll probably just leave that as a broad answer and we'll get into the meat of it. That's okay.
Okay. Just moving slightly out of sequence on how the MIQs are set out. We'd like to cover the air quality issues first. So in terms of this, can we have the borough's general view on whether the plan sets out a justified, clear and effective suite of policies in respect of the air quality and highways implications of waste development? And touching on consistency, particularly with the London plan and national policies in these respects.
Yeah, the boroughs consider that with the proposed modifications, the local air quality and highway implications of waste development are appropriately considered in the plan. As described in our statement, there are essentially two levels effectively that has been assessed. At the strategic level, the sustainability assessment appraised alternative policy approaches, which included consideration of transport and air quality objectives. And at the detailed policy level, policy WP5, protecting and enhancing amenity, is now proposed with a substantial modification, reference MM1.16, which specifies the following matters. And if you don't mind, to read it out in detail, particularly with the public interest in this particular policy matter. So in this additional point on air quality, this modification now proposes air quality and polluting emissions, including dust from approved construction works, on-site waste operations and associated vehicle movements in the locality of new or intensified waste sites, taking account of national air quality objectives and current exceedances, potential impacts within air quality focus areas, air quality management areas and or the mayor's expanded ultra-low emission zone, cumulative impacts with other waste sites, the London plan requirement for development proposals to be at least air quality neutral, and the use of design solutions to prevent or minimize increased exposure of people, particularly vulnerable to poor air quality, such as children, people in poor health, or the elderly. I should have said beforehand that this is one of the, it's now a specification and much more elaborated requirement for testing the amenity impacts of a scheme coming forward. Then we've also proposed further modifications to WP, same policy WP5, reference MM1.19, which is too lengthy, which I wouldn't read out, but They specify the details of any air quality assessment would need to address the matters that this, for greater clarity, what it need to address, such as the London Plan Policy SI1 requirement for development to be at least air neutral, cumulative impacts, post-implementation monitoring and reporting, etc. Furthermore, we're also proposing changes to policy WP9, planning obligations, and it's now proposed with a modification reference MM1.28, which also refers to post-implementation monitoring of air quality and related operations and associated HGV movements. There are also aspects in other policies which are more indirect, such as policies WP1 to WP3, that will have that also will reduce the impacts on air quality and on transport. But I'll leave that as just as a summary at this stage.
So we touched yesterday on the other regimes relevant to waste sites and environmental protection sort of issues. And I think Inspector Norrington was of the view, is it clear from the plan what the interface between those different sorts of regulatory regimes are, and whether anything else needs to be added to it to clarify that? I mean, do you want to reflect on that, Mr. van der Westhuizen?
Yes, excuse me, we have reflected on that, and I don't have the exact form of words, but in principle, there is text that we will consider adding, which will clarify to readers on that very technical matter on Environment Agency licensing regulations and the enforcement, and the local planning authorities enforcement with regards to planning related matters. So that we will be proposing additional text on that.
Okay, I'd like to draw in the representatives from the Wimbledon Park Residents Association in terms of, you've heard what the boroughs have said in terms of how the plan has been developed and some of the modifications that have been proposed to it. And I just welcome your views on those points and any others that you have.
Thank you. Maybe I make a first comment, just a preliminary comment. I appreciate the very large effort that's gone into preparing this plan, and I appreciate it's a very complicated matter. When the 2012 plan was up for consultation, I had very good discussions with Merton, and we made an important change to the plan. I've also acknowledged gratefully the very good discussions with Merton I've also had this time, but unfortunately we haven't reached agreement. I'd perhaps also stress the importance of air quality. As we know, 10,000 people die every year in London, and I believe it's 1 in 8 people in Merton. And looking around this room, if we were all in Merton, that would be on average 2 of us. I think we can agree that the plan must take into account air quality properly, otherwise it wouldn't be sound. Now, there are lots of policies, one could quote on that. The plan has I'm very pleased to hear, which I haven't read in detail, the proposals to WP5. They sound very good, and I would like to read them and perhaps comment at some point on them, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. My problem with the air quality is more to do with the way it's implemented in the plan at present. Shall I continue on that? Yeah. The methodology to assess air pollution in the plan is to look at air focus areas. But they're quite some way away. They're not generally on the route of the HGVs, and they don't always have air pollution problems. So I don't really believe that this is an assessment of the air quality to do with the waste sites. And I think that's very problematic. I know it's been said that it's one's got to find some type of realistic approach to assess this problem. And I think there is one. I mean, the air pollution data is known around certain roads where the waste is being transported around the sites. And if it's not known, always, in some cases, certainly, it's not a lot of effort to go and stick some tubes up and measure it. And I think the councils could have done that. They could also, and I'm less of an expert on this, taken round a particulate matter. It wouldn't have been a lot of work. Now, for Weir Road, one just has to look up on Google Maps to find the main roads leading into it. They are Gap Road, Hayden Road, Durnsford Road, and Plough Lane. And then you open Merton's very good air quality report, and you look up what the air quality is on those roads, and you find the NO2 is above 40. So you have to say that the air quality there is very poor. But if we look in the plan, what we discover is that it's put down as favorable, and I don't think that's correct. And I don't think the plan should go forward with these type of statements in it. I could continue if you like. Yeah. I think it's very understandable that the 2012 plan didn't tackle air pollution properly. But in the meantime, we've come to understand the devastating effects of air pollution. Now, it might have been hoped that when the sites were given permission, the planning process took this into account. But as far as I can see, and I've looked at Weir Road on some of them, this simply didn't happen. There are no restrictions. Air pollution wasn't assessed, nor were the traffic requirements. There's just a limit on the total tonnage. So I think it was very important, is very important, that these sites are reviewed and given correct air quality gradings. Concerning the traffic, we carried out a survey, and I think the councils agree it's not been measured. And the reason I got into this was I simply stood by the roads there and I could see lots and lots of HGVs coming past, and I wondered what was going on. We have carried out a survey and we found more than between 8 and 5 in a workday. There are more than 600 waste carrying HGVs going to and from the site. That's about 1 a minute. We also noted that 4/5 of these were going to the south, which indicates that this site is transporting its waste from quite lower down in the borough and probably much further down. I think that needs, we've made one observation, but I think it would be good to try and find out what's really going on there. I don't agree with the statement that reorganizing the waste processing would naturally increase the air pollution, because here is a case where it wouldn't. I think on the question of preserving the sites, and there's been a lot of discussion of that already here. I note that some of the, well, sorry, can I just get this? I think preserving the sites is in contradiction with, say, also bits of the London plan on air pollution. Which it doesn't satisfy. And I noticed some of the contractors also, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what they say. The sites, it's very inflexible, the plan as it is.
Could I pause you there, Mr. West, and
Yes.
go over to the boroughs for some reactions to those initial points? It's okay. So, Mr. James.
I'll do a few, and I might pass on the air quality focus areas to my colleague, Mr. Witter. But just to be clear, none of the operators, so those extant operating sites, they are all operating at the moment. And we have no correspondence from them saying that, unlike other sites where they are winding down or they do not want to be safe, or they are continuing to operate. So in accordance with the London plan, we are safeguarding those sites. I'm not, as this examination is about the soundness of this plan, I'm not going to comment on the historic applications and their and how they were assessed and how they're enforced. But I would point out that this policy, as I pointed out with the modifications, that the draft plan has assessments, mitigations, and WP5, the list of additional documents that will be required, now specifies in much greater detail what kind of air quality impacts need to be addressed in an air quality assessment to be submitted. So there's a much greater clarity on that matter. There's also, we've clarified in another modification, again, to that same schedule with regards to the transport assessment. I'm just looking for the reference number. Main mod 1.20, we clarified which kinds of transport strategy documents that we will require. And as part of those transport strategy documents, we can seek improvements in greater detail with regards to the impacts of proposed schemes and the planning obligations and conditions on controlling any future schemes come forward. I would also highlight the fact that particularly those 3 sites in Weir Road, they are not indicated as suitable in the table for intensification. And we have no information from the developers that they are intending any further intensification of those sites. If my colleague, Mr. Witter, can just comment on the point about the relevance of the air quality focus areas.
Just before you do that as well, one of your colleagues from the air quality monitoring team, I think, was on the Zoom call. It might be helpful as well. There's kind of 3 things happening here, isn't there? There's the planning permission, and how is air quality taken into account in monitoring aspects of that planning permission, not the plan. Probably something that your colleague from the air quality team can mention. Is whether or not the plan goes far enough in terms of considering air quality as an issue, and bear in mind the plan can't retrospectively apply things, it can only apply to things what's going forward. So does the plan do enough there? The third thing, I think, is notwithstanding all of that, how is the borough as a whole taking into account air quality, particularly when the issues go well beyond the site? So it's kind of 3 things that perhaps your air quality colleague might want to think about. So it's what happens currently. Does the plan go far enough? And thinking about how air quality as a whole is monitored. And what happens if there's an issue? These are not things I'm directing to you, Mr. Van der Veers, and it's things that I'm perhaps directing to your air quality, but it's kind of just to help the debate and understand where the positions are without getting into technicalities and everything else. There's kind of 3 steps here that I think we can deal with in conversation. And it's that I'd like to understand a little bit from myself and Mr. Fort's perspective, just to get that appreciation. What do you do now? Does the plan go far enough? And what do you do about this wider aspect of air quality? How do you monitor it? And what happens when it goes off the scale? So at that particular point, I'm probably going to pull in by default your air quality colleague.
Thank you very much. Shall I just start with the point about quality focus areas, because that was mentioned first. I think a close reading of the sustainability appraisal report at the regulation 19 stage, so the final version, but also preceding versions of the report, will show that we do not rely on the location of air quality focus areas as the basis for giving the plan a green light for air quality. It's mentioned because as part of our baseline assessment, it's a relevant strategic piece of information to set the safeguarded waste sites in context in terms of relevant areas and designations. And it would be amiss to leave that out. But if the commentary associated with the appraisal matrix itself, where we look at the impact of the overall strategic approach in terms of not identifying new sites, but also the detail of policy WP5, which has now been further significantly strengthened. The location of air quality focus areas doesn't really play a big role in our arguments as to why the strategy being put forward is the most sustainable strategy from the point of view of air quality.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. Can I bring your colleague in? I'm kind of forcing your colleague to come in, and I can't remember her name. I do apologise, to come in about the 3 stages that I talked about there. In terms of where perhaps our thinking is going, I can understand the modification. I think the modification just considerably strengthen future proposals from the Wimbledon Park Residents Association. And I appreciate you've not seen that yet, and you probably will want to comment on that in due course. But I think the concern is the here and the now that's been raised. And it is this question that I do really want your colleague to come in on, who's still not coming in, about what happens with site monitoring now. How is air quality considered? How do we take into account the longer borough-wide issues of air quality along transportation corridors? And there was another point actually I missed, that there was some comment whether or not the plan's got its reference to air quality right. So those are the 3 kind of things that perhaps I just want to draw out from your elusive colleague. She dropped off. I think she seems to have dropped off the Zoom call by the sounds of things.
Hello, my apologies. I'm really struggling with the connection today. Sorry, Tara. Hello. Can everyone hear me at the moment?
We can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay.
Did you get the basis of the kind of 3 questions that I posed to you?
I do apologise. My connection is very unstable, so I've been in and out. So if you could summarise just the 3 questions, that would be very helpful. I apologise.
Kind of 3 broad questions to help focus the debate was first of all, the existing site, if it generates air quality issues, how is air quality in that context monitored?
Mm-hmm.
and what's the regime for dealing with it if there is a serious issue? The second one is this a plan? Does a plan adequately address air quality? And there's two aspects to that question. The first one, there's a suggestion that the plan's got its baseline wrong in terms of this particular site. The next part of that was whether or not the revisions to the policy, the modifications suggested by the boroughs, goes far enough in addressing future issues. And there's kind of a caveat in that. There's a balance between the here and the now, and what limitations of plans might have on that now, but equally whether or not the going forward is adequately catered for in terms of air quality and those modifications. And the last part is a more general approach to air quality, where transportation corridors that's bringing waste, and it's not just waste, it's lots of other activities as well. How is that monitored, and what's the kind of plan to deal with exceedances? How is that brought into the system? And I appreciate some of that is not planning legislation, but nonetheless there's a correlation here to what we are looking at and what concerns have been raised. So it's that kind of approach, just to take us through how it is considered in that context.
Okay, I will do my best. So currently the sites, if they have a waste license which is regulated by the Environment Agency. So any complaints received pertaining to air quality, emissions control from dust and such like from the sites, then the Environment Agency would be the regulator to liaise with the sites to bring that back under control. We as a local authority would obviously have an interest in that as well, because we safeguard local air quality. So that would be the regime for dealing with sites at this point in time.
Just before you move on from that, because I'm kind of just thinking that the next question that's probably going to be raised in that. So if the Environment Agency are responsible for air quality monitoring, how do residents understand the results of that? If there is a concern, how are those concerns addressed? And you mentioned about we have a role in that. Well, what is the borough's role in that also? So it seems to me, and forgive me, I'm just kind of put it in simple bold flags that responsibility is the Environment Agency, but we have a role. I'm not so sure what the role is, but equally, I'm not so sure how the monitoring data gets published so that people can understand what's happening, and equally to understand what the intervention levels are for something that's not right.
So the role we have to play in the pollution team here at Merton, for example, any complaints raised would be would come to us. So we would have officers that could attend site to discuss any concerns with the operators. But ultimately, if they have an environmental permit on the site, then the enforcement would fall to the Environment Agency. But we would be there to liaise to ensure that any concerns were being addressed. They're all recorded on our complaint management system. Sorry, how do I move on from?
I think you've answered the part of that question in the sense that the Environment Agency would address any concerns. You would record it on your environmental management system. You would be involved in addressing those concerns. I think and I appreciate you might not be able to answer this fully, but the next part of my question was, well, how does the community know the results of that? And how does the community know intervention levels? And there's possibly a distinction between kind of dust emissions and localized nuisance as opposed to real air quality monitoring. And I'm kind of not clear whether or not the Environment Agency or intervention would be in response to complaints regarding fugitive dust emissions as opposed to really monitoring air quality. So perhaps if you can tell us on those points, and then we'll move on to the policy itself.
And in answer to your question, we would look at any fugitive dust emissions. In terms of monitoring, actually monitoring emissions to have a quantitative value on those, then that would be down to permit conditions and if anything's actually stated on that, which I can't answer at the moment if that's the case for the sites currently. So in terms of feeding back to the community, the best course of action would be if there were complaints to set up communications between the operator and residents really, and we could facilitate that.
I'm sure Mr. West and colleague will have a comment on that in a moment, but if you can move us on to the next part, and we'll start with the first part, that the plan may have made an erroneous baseline recording of what the air quality position was. So what I'd like to know is how was that baseline position established? What monitoring took place regarding air quality across the plan area to reflect some of those issues in this plan? And then it's kind of explaining to me, how do you keep monitoring that to ensure that that baseline doesn't shift throughout the plan period? That's a complex question. In simple terms, what did you do to make the assumption that you made? And how do you ensure that the assumption you made remains the same going forward in terms of air quality monitoring, and distinguish between air quality monitoring and fugitive dust emissions, because they are different.
Absolutely. So in terms of the wider picture, I believe that the air quality focus area was one of the methods of looking at baseline. An air quality focus area is some distance away, up to 2 kilometres away from the Weir Road. An air quality focus area is an area that exceeds the EU NO2 limits annual mean, and also represents an area of high density population wise. So we keep a close eye on those areas because of exposure. We do monitor air quality around the borough using a network of diffusion tubes. So we have trend data, long-term trend data, and we also have model data to look at future projections. Moving forward, because the diffusion tube network has some limitations, we are installing a network of a number of high quality air quality sensors through the Breathe London project. This is an Innovate project, so we will be able to look at these will be coupled with vivacity traffic sensors. So these will look at movements and flow across the borough at key points, and also couple that with real-time air quality data. The air quality data will be a public asset, and that will be available to the members of the public via an online portal. The monitoring will cover strategic routes through the borough, the industrial estates, town centres and other key areas. So moving forward, we will get a much more detailed picture of air quality across the borough, and also be able to attribute that to vehicle type as well, looking at vehicle counts and types.
Okay, but Mr. West made the point that the plan reflects the air quality in regard to this particular site as being favourable. And I just want to understand how the decision was made, what monitoring took place to come to that conclusion. Because we've talked about where some of the air quality action zones are in terms of some of the serious issues. But somebody must have made a judgment somewhere to say that air quality in this particular site is favourable. And I just want to understand how that judgment was made, because the accusation was that it's perhaps not favourable.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on who made that statement that it's favourable. From our air quality monitoring, and Mr. West is absolutely right, our annual report that we make to the GLA, air quality in that area, so Gap Road, Hayden's Road, Plough Lane, we have found for a number of years that it does exceed the EU objective. So that's over the 40 micrograms per metre cubed on an annual basis. That has reduced, but it is currently, well, last year was a year out of the norm, as we all appreciate, and it did meet the objectives last year in those 3 locations. So if we were looking at data from last year, then yes, it's favourable, although looking further back, then it was above the annual mean for NO2. We have looked at our data so far for this year, so we have January to July. And indications are that the mean will be achieved in those 3 locations. It might be because there's been just a general change in the way people are moving around the borough, and it would suggest emissions in road-based emissions. Obviously, these sites were operating business as usual during the lockdown last year. Public, local movements, private vehicles that were much reduced. So that would seem that the HGVs may not be as impactful as what people.
Okay, before I bring with your colleagues in, who was eager to explain, I think you're very eager to explain about this favourable issue. But I'm going to keep the flow going with yourself for a second, because you've touched upon there about monitoring and what the monitoring has told us about the site in terms of exceedance levels. So the fact that there has been and may be exceedance levels, what does that mean? What's the response to that? What do you do about it? Just say that's fine, exceedance level. What is the action that provokes?
So where we have areas of exceedance, from a strategic point of view, we need cleaner vehicles, because most of over 60% or around 60% of pollution comes from road transport in the borough. We know that through source apportionment. So we need a strategic approach to lower those emissions through better vehicle technologies. So we have a whole raft of things through transport policies to encourage the use of cleaner vehicles, so moving away from diesel vehicles, electrification, etc. When we're looking at businesses, we have fleet training programs, and encourage the use of cleaner freight. Obviously, when we're looking at any new developments in an area of exceedance, we are looking for them to be air quality neutral, or at least air quality neutral. So we're not then worsening the current situation. So in areas of poor air quality, we're looking to make sure that doesn't deteriorate further. So there is a lot of things.
Let's pull you back to a more focused issue on the site, and then we'll bring in your colleague. We've talked about some of the interventions there that you do, and they fairly are broad brush, wide sweeping interventions. But focus back on this site. If the community's been advised that there is an air quality exceedance, what could the community expect to see happen? Not the wider things that take the longer term, kind of trying to change thinking as opposed to enforcement. But what could the community expect to see on this particular site where there is evidence that the air quality levels are being exceeded? What would you do?
So again, here, and in an industrial setting, it would be working with the operators. I mean, to encourage them to use cleaner fleet, and it's based around good maintenance of plant and vehicles and best practice on site, adhering to their planning and waste licensing conditions. And then moving forward, if there's any further development on site, intensification, which I don't believe is scheduled here, but if there was intensification, then any moving forward, any development, any further planning applications, it would need to be, they would need to have an air quality assessment. And at that time, case by case, we'd make a full review of the air quality situation and any proposed changes to make sure that they had been properly considered for their impacts and sufficiently mitigated so they wouldn't increase the pollution. The current
Okay,
level.
last point, I promise, and we'll let somebody else have a say. You've mentioned there what you would do in terms of intervention, but everything you mentioned there seemed to be voluntary action. You would talk to them about cleaner vehicles. Well, you can talk to me about cleaner vehicles, but I'm not going to change the vehicle. You can talk to me about lots of things, and I'll take on board your comments, but I'm probably not going to do anything about it because it's not an issue for me, really. But this is me being devil's advocate. So beyond the kind of gentle approach of casual persuasion, what actual enforcement could you invoke where there was continual breaches of air quality standards?
With any breaches would have to firstly be attributed to a specific operator, and these are levels that at the moment, if we're talking on a road network, that can't be attributed to a specific operator. If it was actual measured air quality levels on a site by equipment on a site to measure emissions, and they were found to be in breach, then that's quite clear-cut enforcement action could be taken by the regulator. But if we're talking about exceedances on our road network that is near to an industrial site, then that's obviously we've got to it has to be really clear who is causing that breach to take enforcement action, and that's where we talk about as you say, that the soft touches at the moment to existing operators who have not been identified for an exceedance. And then that's the current situation. But moving forward, with a new planning application, we could look at having tighter controls in place. So, and then we'd look at the London plan, the new London plan, our local policies requiring them to meet certain conditions for their vehicles. To have the cleaner
said that
vehicles
was
at
the
that
last
point.
question, but I'm sorry, there's going to be one more. And the last one's a kind of killer punch one. It's the one that you're not going to like. Have you actually monitored air quality on this site?
We haven't. Well, as a local authority, I don't believe so at the moment. Not actually there in the local area. Yes, as we've mentioned. I believe the Environment Agency may have conducted some of their own monitoring down there. But moving forward, I mentioned the new network of monitors, and they are proposed at that location. So that'll be.
When you said that location,
shortly.
I mean, we've got.
Oh, sorry. So the industrial estates in the borough, they will be monitored.
So by that, do I take it that we're not sure whether we've monitored air quality at the site? We might have monitored air quality in the locality, but nonetheless, going forward, and you can tell me in a second what you mean by going forward in the future, when that means. But in the future, and you can tell me the timescale on that, there will be air quality monitoring occurring at this site. And will the community have access to the results of that air quality monitoring?
Yes. So when I say moving forward, these are the new network of monitors. They should be live by the end of this month. There has been a slight delay on the air quality sensors due to the number that we've ordered, and that will be publicly. That information is a public asset that will be available on a website essentially, so that would be available to anybody. And your question, have we specifically monitored that site? I can only answer for what I know at this time, and in the time that I've been at Merton Council, which is the last 3 years, I haven't monitored. My team hasn't monitored there, so that's the short answer to that.
Thank you for those, well, very honest and very factual answers. I appreciate that. Your colleague's been desperately to come in here. I can see him fidgeting, and I think I purposely calmed him down to keep you going, I think, but perhaps I'll bring you on that point and I'll go back to Inspector Fort.
Thank you, Mr. Normington. 2 points just to clarify there. I think the positive impact, was that the phrase? I think it was. Yeah, I contribute that to Mr. I also heard that and I was like, what's the source? So I will put that to Mr. West to say where, because I think he used the phrase. Okay, and then the other point was just the on the enforcement point that we've, as part of the modification, one of the transport mechanisms that we could use, subject to justification, is a delivery service plan or a freight plan. And as part of the guidance, the Transport for London guidance about such plans, it is recommended that a recognized freight accreditation schemes such as FORS, F-O-R-S, which I now forget exactly what the acronym stands for, but those, they have a series of requirements, and so these are recommended that as part of those service delivery plans, we can attach them as effectively conditions to, and in that way secure those freight improvements which capture effectively off-site improvements via the fleet. So that's one of the potential mechanisms that we can use.
Sorry, Inspector Fort, just one last question then, and I promise I'll shut up then and let somebody else have a go at pushing you. I think going back to the monitoring framework then, and to some extent the kind of environmental performance of sites, and I'm not suggesting you should do that, but I'm suggesting just have a think about it. In terms of the contribution the plan makes to mitigating, managing air quality across London, because waste development can give rise to air quality management issues. Is there any correlation? In those what I'm trying to find out, how would I know whether the policy amendments and to some extent the other things that you've mentioned there, that the plan is driving and thinking about air quality and lots of other things, probably in climate change, but let's just stick with air quality, that the plan is sufficiently being monitored to ensure that it's not driving air quality in the wrong direction, it's actually pulling it back in the right direction. So how would I understand if I were to say, well, I want to look at your annual monitoring report in 4 years' time, and I want to understand what this plan's done for air quality across South London. How would I get that? Or would you direct me to look at somewhere else?
I think it should be possible. In fact, it will be possible for the annual monitoring report to look at every waste planning proposal which gets granted or gets implemented year by year, and actually have a very close look at what planning obligations and conditions have been set, and also what is contained in the air quality assessments and also transport impact assessments. First and foremost, to record what at least is being proposed or being promised or being conditioned, and that there should be sufficient information from that planning submission to have an idea of commitments on behalf of the developer to ongoing monitoring, because there are conditions, or there can be conditions for submission of monitoring information which we expect to become much more commonly seen because of our changes to the policy which we are putting forward in the draft plan, but also through our modifications, which significantly strengthen those requirements that we would expect from developers. So the information should be available from those planning applications, and it should be possible to report each year in the AMR.
It's probably something that you probably do need to think about, because obviously if the modification is put forward, then we need to understand how the modification of that policy itself is delivering the things that you need to do. So when you say it should be possible, what I'm probably suggesting is we need to think about how those amendments to that policy are monitored going forward in the monitoring framework then, because otherwise you will not know if this policy has been effective in the longer term. So it's just, we've got the change to the policy. We probably need the corresponding change to ensure that you're monitoring what the policy is trying to do. Otherwise, you don't know.
If I can just respond to that final point, to confirm that we will go away and we will consider that, particularly the monitoring of the air quality.
Mr. West, you want to come in, but I wondered, I've got a question for you as well. In terms of the waste plan, are there any further changes you'd like to see that perhaps in terms of air quality and what they might be?
I was glad to see that there was no defense of this air focus area strategy. The definition was given of air focus areas, but it's not always the case that that's what they are. But I noticed there was no defense. And I think it's the only assessment of air quality in the plan. So I think this is pretty problematic. You asked why the site in Weir Road got a plus question mark. Okay, favorable. I can be corrected on this. I believe it says there that it was not near an air focus area, which was 2 kilometers away. I was surprised to hear the statement that air quality was not so relevant. I think it's highly relevant and people are dying as a result of it. So that's one set of comments I have. Shall I continue?
I just, in terms of what the plan could do differently to address those things, could I have your views on that, please, Mr. West?
Yeah, I was glad to hear the comments of the gentleman down there. I think we have a problem with a lot of existing sites that should really not be where they are. And I'll come to that in a bit. But I think the first thing the plan should do is assess, since there was no assessment, assess what the air quality is for these sites. And this means putting tubes on the roads near the sites that are being used by the HGVs. And this could be done systematically and reported in the very good air quality reports that the council makes. I personally would like to see it done before the plan is published and the information taken into account. I would make one other point that it's not the general air quality in London that's at issue here. It's the air quality on the particular roads that the HGVs are going down. If you stand on these roads, and I have quite sensitive lungs, it's really very difficult for me to stand there. So I think where one might, there's a monitor may be placed in Plough Lane, but that's just Plough Lane, which is badly affected. But you really need an overall picture of what's going on. And in particular, you could take a particulate meter down. If you took it to the sites, I think you'd be have impressive results, which is natural. They can't avoid it to some extent. I noticed that, that there's been no really effective measures for what you can do for the existing sites. So what I would hope there is that there is some path where the sites are known to have substantial air pollution and traffic congestion. The plan contains a pathway for these sites to be, well, the waste to be processed somewhere else. I couldn't help noting this morning the comments of the lady from DB Cargo, who had a very good site and wanted it to be used, but it was hesitant to be used on the grounds that we had sufficient capacity, and we have too much capacity, in fact. So there is some leeway for looking at how you can redistribute the waste that's being processed. And in doing that, you could look at the proximity of where the waste is being generated, and this might lower air pollution. One thing I would appreciate, perhaps I'm not in a position to say how the plan should be modified to provide such a pathway, but I'd welcome any suggestions on how to do it.
Thank you. Mr. van der Westhuizen.
Just a quick clarification that both the modification MM119, which is to MM116, which is to WP5, and MM119, which is to the schedule to WP5, specify that cumulative impacts would need to be, any proposal coming forward as part of their air quality impact assessments, they'll have to demonstrate cumulative impacts, and that should go some way to pick up the impacts from the existing scheme or the ambient levels, and then projections of what the future is. So that might be one mechanism forward, and that's already in the modifications.
Okay, that's a good point, and it is how we will take into account future things. But just going back to the point you made about what's the linkage about the current sites, and I'm just slightly going back to the monitoring regime, and I'm thinking about what are the matters that trigger a review of the plan. So if for instance that the results of this new monitoring system, and I appreciate what you said about diffusion tubes, but it sounds they're even getting a better system that's going to be installed this month in the borough in terms of air quality monitoring. So we can just perhaps confirm that from Ms. Crutchley in a moment. But in terms of what might trigger a review of a plan, if there was a particular area where there was an incredible exceedance of air quality and some intervention need to be taken, and we had a situation whereby we knew that we had plenty of capacity anyway, but part of the reasons for the air quality might be not just waste, but other developments of which waste might be an ancillary factor. How would the monitoring of the plan take into account that there is been a change in environmental circumstances in the locality? Coupling that with still got capacity, do we need to examine whether or not the plan needs to be re-looked at, or aspects of the plan need to be looked at to ensure that the environmental change and the unacceptability of that is or isn't being caused by actions in the plan, and whether or not the plan needs to have some kind of review at an appropriate point to address that matter. In other words, if it's getting worse, we can do two things. We can accept it and we can deal with it in 15 years' time as far as this plan goes. But by the sounds of it, there is a monitoring framework in place that can pick this up. So is there anything to say that you couldn't have, and I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, you think about these things like all things, but it seems to me in terms of what could the plan do, and if I'm being quite blunt at this stage, probably nothing. at this stage. But what it can do is be more proactive about how it monitors environmental effects of waste activities, and then reassesses those effects against persistent exceedance of levels. And if the plan implementation of its policies is creating a problem, then that might be a matter to at least take some time to review. I'm not suggesting it might even be a formal review in that sense, but to review whether or not interventions are required, which could be partial or full review of the plan. What would be wrong with that approach that would give the linkage that Mr. West is suggesting as a monitoring indicator? Because we're going to do it. You're going to have more easily online intelligence from your air quality colleagues. Some of the aspects of activity from the waste management policies are contributing to that air quality matter. And I appreciate it's hard as which is waste and which isn't. And I appreciate you've got that debate to go through. But in theory, the environmental check of progress, and you can push this to other aspects of the plan if you wanted to. I'm not suggesting you do that, but you could go for flood risk, you could go through climate change and all sorts of things. But the environmental effect of the plan as a monitoring indicator to take some judgment, or at least a soundbite as to whether or not do we need to change anything, but not in 15 years' time, doesn't seem to me to be unreasonable nor unachievable. It's just giving a framework for let's just have a sense check. Is a plan doing everything it should do from an environmental perspective, or does a plan need to just take a pause and let's have a think, are we contributing to this in the way that our policies are working? Because you've got the intelligence from your environmental health colleagues and air quality colleagues. So in terms of Mr. West's point, where would the linkage be? If I'm being quite blunt, that's probably the only linkage in policy terms I think you could possibly do. But it just enables at least some kind of recognition that let's just have a sense check of what this is doing for air quality. Would that be beyond the wit of man to do that?
I think a partial answer. I mean, it's a very broad question, but what one linkage is if a site comes forward for intensification, so therefore there would be a
go back. Don't go intensification. I'm not looking at the future. I'm looking at the here and the now.
Yeah. Yes, I know. If a site came forward for intensification during the course of this new plan, and which could lead to more lorry movements, potentially with higher tonnages, if they are following our modified version of WP5, they should be looking at cumulative impacts with nearby sites. So actually the ongoing monitoring from all available sources of monitoring across the plan area, that should have a direct feedback to the way in which we deal with planning applications for site intensification. But that's not a complete answer, but it's just one example of where we wouldn't just be monitoring for the sake of monitoring, but it could actually feed back into better outcomes.
Okay, I'll bring Mr. Van der White. I've never had to say your name before. I've left it to Mr. Fort. I'll bring Eben in a moment. The only reason I say I'm aware that there are other plans which just tend to look a little bit more at environmental performance as a trigger for review. And I'm not suggesting you need to copy other plans at all. But this going forward doesn't help the here and the now that the Resident Association are alerting you to, from the fact that existing operations as associated with waste management from the current climate is exceeding air quality issues. Might change as we move to more cleaner vehicle fleets by default and other things anyway. But it's just have a think about it. I'm not going to ask you for the answer now, but Mr. West has raised this linkage, and the only linkage I can think of on the hoof, and that's why it's dangerous to think sometimes on the hoof and with a microphone on, is something that has a sense check on environmental performance, because it's important that we sense check whether or not the plan is doing its right things, not just for the capacities, but also the environmental impact of what it's doing needs to have some kind of sense check. And there has been other plans that have kind of tried to grapple with this very issue. And in this particular thing I'm thinking about, it was more about fugitive dust, but nonetheless, they tried to look at a way that they could do some sense check through monitoring of environmental performance to see whether any other interventions were required to revisit the policies in the plan to address those environmental implications that the plan was directly and indirectly causing. So it's just something that the only thing I can think about of the youth is how can you test that linkage then? Is to have some kind of monitoring framework around that to sense check the environmental effects of the plan.
And I think to develop that a bit further, we've heard that there's a healthy position, particularly on CDE capacity, which seems to be what the bulk of the Weir Road sites are dealing with, and that taken together with potential air quality implications, monitoring of that as part of the monitoring of the plan, and then the other objective of the plan that we talked about, which was not safeguarding more waste sites than are needed because of the demand for general industrial uses. So it's just, I suppose it's either monitoring of the plan with those things together. Is there a trigger there? It needs a review because of X, Y, and Z. I don't have the answer. I'm thinking on the hoof as well here, Inspector Normington. But if you could give some thought to that, I think in terms of there's other air quality matters which I think are clearly subject to other regimes. But insofar as this plan could deal with it, I wonder if you could, pay attention to that in thinking about how that monitoring could work. I'm sorry, Mr. van der Westhuizen.
Just a quick, I was just thinking, so we have made a commitment to think about the monitoring, and it would be typically, if you look at the proposed monitoring, the modified monitoring table, each indicator has a section at the end, which is management actions, which identifies what we will do, when we will do it. And I would have thought that's the bit where we're really going to have to think about hard and in collaboration with our colleagues in environmental health.
Mr. West.
Encouraged, sorry, by what I hear. I think it's an excellent suggestion that somehow there's a review of these troublesome sites, and given the excess there is and the sites that want to be sites, I think some sort of pathway could be clear here. One other point, I heard mention of some general monitoring, systematic monitoring. I'm not sure what this is. It could be just the ones that they're putting up, the machines, but they're in particular locations, and it wouldn't constitute a monitoring of the whole thing. I don't think it would be so much effort to isolate the roads where there are problems and simply put the NO2 tubes up and take the particulate round. And even the community around that would do it for the councils, I expect.
So could bring Ms. Crutchley on that particular point, Mr. West, so she can speak to you direct on that matter.
Hello, thank you, Inspector Normington. Yes, Mr. West, I mean, as you know, we already work with the community and support West and Wimbledon Park Residents Association to complete their own. It is fantastic to have community members on board to support our team to monitor, to do some additional monitoring. So we can always look at extending that, but I think moving forward, keep using the forward, but shortly in the coming month or so, We will have the better coverage of more accurate air quality monitoring. So instead of the good old diffusion tube, we will have some continuous data available to us. So I think we'll, with that, that will give us a better level of understanding of what's going on, and we'll capture, as you say, some of these roads where the HGVs do move along.
Just outside of this kind of forum, Ms. Crutchley, is there already, and Mr. Westwing could probably help me here, is there already a dialogue between yourself and Mr. West's group in terms of looking at this as a localized issue and getting that community support and help if need be about the location of subsequent monitoring? Does that already occur? Is it in place, or is it something that needs to happen? And it's not a soundness issue by any stretch of the imagination.
If I could just start, and then if Mr. West wants to add anything, that would be lovely. So we have an environmental subgroup, which we ourselves at the council, we have officers attend, and also stakeholders in the community. So we invite their representatives from our local community action groups. And it's a two-way dialogue there. So we look at actions from our air quality action plan. Of that includes monitoring, and community members can bring concerns to us, and we can look at supporting additional monitoring in those locations. So I'm not aware of any recent meetings where this has been raised in that forum. I did have a period of absence from work, but I'm not aware if that has been covered. If not, we can definitely bring that up in the next meeting. We meet quarterly, and to see if we can need any more. Any additional monitoring in terms of the diffusion tubes, at least in that area. Happy to do that.
I think it would be, a first step would be to isolate where you want to put the tubes up and have a list. And then one can see whether one can get cooperation from community, and if not, the council will have to do them themselves.
Yeah, we're happy to have that conversation.
I'd be very grateful for such conversations, and I don't think it has happened in the past, except for Davida here, and I'd welcome it.
Great, we'll sort that out then.
I think that's very helpful. I mean, that's a couple of things there from my perspective. I'll bring Inspector Thorpe back in. Mr. Ford is used to sitting in that kind of position. I do apologise, Inspector Ford. But it seems to me that we've probably gone as far as we can in teasing out some of the issues that need to be thought about in terms of some of the baseline stuff. Teasing out some of the things going forward. I'm from without prejudice to our report, there does seem to be a more proactive thought process going forward with the modification about future sites and how that's taken on board, and that seems to have been well thought through, and I appreciate you need to look at that in some detail, and you'll be given the opportunity to do that and comment, of course, in due course. So that seems to be the going forward aspect of the plan, does seem to be catered for the residents' concerns either here and now, and there's a little bit of that in the plan where we might be able to look at that, some monitoring regime that might trigger review of plan, coupled with other aspects of throughput, capacity, surplus, etc. And then the other side, completely outside of the plan, which sounds like it does need to happen, is this re-establishment of dialogue about air quality monitoring. So it's almost me saying, well, we haven't had an home win, we haven't had an away win, we've probably got a score draw here, but there's some betterment come out of that, because at least, if nothing else, the here and now, there's a dialogue stream for air quality monitoring that's occurring here and now, and your input into that is absolutely welcomed through Ms. Crutch's intervention there. So it seems to me that there is something, there's some good come out of our discussions, a couple of things to go away and think about, but there are limitations to what the plan can do with the here and now. Make no secret about that. But nonetheless, there is a better dialogue you can have, I think, with the council, and I think that open doors being just given to you on that specific issue, on that specific site, to have that intervention and to see what we can do about the here and now. And some of that monitoring may then feed into those matters we've talked about in terms of having a look at the monitoring regime. So we kind of try to square the circle a little bit as much as we can without saying that the plan, the plan is, it's difficult sometimes to deal with planning permission that's already there without the will of the operator. Completely different to discussions this morning where the will of the operator was completely different to the current position as far as the council knows it. But nonetheless, you have issues. And at least if nothing else today, we've teased out a mechanism for you to directly involve yourselves now in those issues. And we've teased out a potential mechanism to see how those results of monitoring those issues can be fed into review of the plan. So but it's probably, I'm not so sure we can go much further on that from what we can direct, but I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I never thought you could wave a magic wand and just simply change this site. It has to be a process. I think we've made good progress. I think if we have a proper monitoring regime, we'll figure out what's going on. And then if the plan is modified for a path, as you suggest, then eventually what should happen will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. West. So it's just a little after 2:45. So if we could adjourn now and resume at just after 3 o'clock.